Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our next session of reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Today we're going to be looking at Book 6 of The Spirit of the Laws, which is the penultimate chapter of Part 1. Um, so let's go right into it. Book is called The Consequences of the Principles of Various Governments in Relation to the Simplicities of Civil and Criminal Laws, the Forms of Judgment, and the Establishment of Penalties. So the question of how the various forms of government, the various government types, the three forms he talks about, and their principles, how they relate to the question of the simplicity or complexity of civil and criminal laws, how judgments are formed, and the establishment of penalties. On the simplicity of civil laws in the various governments, monarchical government does not admit of such simple laws as does despotic government. So despotic government, simple laws; monarchical government has to have complex laws. In monarchical government, there must be tribunals. These tribunals give decisions. These decisions should be preserved. They should be learned so that one judges there today as one judged there yesterday, and so that the citizens' property and lives are secured and fixed as the very constitution of the state. So, therefore, this idea that you need to have the tribunals, and tribunals should be remembered, and there should be fixed rules. In monarchy, the administering of justice that hands down decisions not only about life and goods, but also about honor requires scrupulous inquiries. The fastidiousness, fastidious means the concernedness and very precision and following of rules of the judges grow as more issues are deposited with him and as he pronounces upon greater interest. So therefore, this kind of judges grows with more issues that are deposited upon him, and as he pronounces on, in other words, as pronounced on greater interest, the importance of the things he does growing. In the laws of these states, therefore, one must not be astonished to find so many rules, restrictions, and extensions that multiply particular cases, and seems to make an art of reasoning itself. So therefore, this idea here he says about in monarchy, the laws become very complex, and they grow in importance, and the rules it becomes like a kind of form of reasoning itself. Um, the difference in rank, origins, and conditions that are established in monarchical governments often carry with them distinctions in the nature of men's goods, and the laws regarding the constitution of this state can increase the numbers of these distinctions. Thus, among ourselves, goods are inherited, acquired, and seized, dartal, peripheral, paternal, and maternal. So, therefore, this okay, among ourselves, goods are inherited, acquired, or seized. They could be dartal, uh, 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 peripheral, or paternal, and maternal. Those of paternal states of several kinds. Free substituted those not of the lineage or not. Noble, freely held, or common goods. Ground rents, or those given a price in silver. Each sort of goods is subject to particular rules. These must be followed in order to make I deal with the noise. Sorry. Uh, he says each sort of these goods subject to particular rules, and thus must be followed in order to make the disposition of the goods, which further removes simplicity. Our government, in our governments, fiefs became hereditary. The nobility had to have had a certain standing, so that the owners of a fief is a piece of land or territory, something that was given to them by the crown or something, would be in a position to serve the prince. This produced various variations. For example, there are countries in which fiefs could not be divided among brothers, and others, younger brothers could receive a more extensive proportion of their own. Next paragraph. And the monarch, who knows each of his provinces can set up various laws or permit different customs. But the despot knows nothing and can attend to nothing. He must approach everything in a general way. He governs with a rigid will that is the same in all circumstances. All is flattened beneath his feet. So therefore, monarchy is allowed for differentiation. That can be complexity, and that different provinces can have different rules. Okay, where in monarchy, everything has to be the same. Everything has to be flat under his rule. It says here. In monarchies, in proportion to the number of judgments made by tribunals, jurisprudence is responsible for decisions that are sometimes inconsistent, because successive judges think differently, or because suits are sometimes well and sometimes poorly defended, and finally because an infinity of abuses slip into whatever is touched by the hands of men. So therefore, in other words, things are all these reasons explain why sometimes there's going to be different judges and different decisions. This is a necessary ill that the legislature corrects from time to time, as being an ill that is contrary even to the spirit of moderate government. For when one is obliged to turn to the tribunals, it must be because the nature of the Constitution must not be the Constitution, because of the nature of the Constitution, and not because of the inconsistency and the uncertainty of the law. So, therefore, in other words, that it's because the imperfectness of the Constitution itself, that people have turned to tribunals. In other words, obliged turn. It's because of the nature of the Constitution, not because of the inconsistencies and uncertainty of the laws. So, therefore, this is interesting that the laws are uncertain because anything men touches, but as touches the Constitution, creates this problem, right? There must be privileges in governments where there are necessary distinctions between persons. Okay? Thus, this further diminishes simplicity and produces a thousand exceptions. One of the privileges least burden to society, and least of all to him who gives it, is that of being allowed to plead before one tribunal rather than another. Otherwise, there are new suits, that is, those which seek a certain tribunal before which one must plead. The peoples in despotic states present in a very different case. I do not know on what matter the legislature could enact or the magistrate judge in these countries. It follows from the fact that the lands belong to the prince that there are scarcely any civil laws concerning ownership of lands. It follows from the sovereign's rights to inherit that there are no laws concerning inheritance. Because trade belongs exclusively to the despot in some countries, all sorts of laws concerning commerce are rendered useless. Because marriages are contracted with female slaves, and there are scarcely any civil laws about dowries and the privilege of wives. Another result of the prodigious multitude of slaves there is that scarcely anyone has a will of his own, and consequently scarcely anyone is answerable for his conduct before a judge. Most moral actions, which are nothing but the wills of the father, the husband, or the master, are regulated by them and not the magistrates. So therefore, in despotic states, what ends up happening is that it's either the father or the master, right? The father or the master, the father, the husband or the master will determine what happens. There's not going to be, not magistrates. And therefore, there's going to be this less complexity. There's going to be more command. There's not, and because these things are under these things, they're not going to have all the things he says, that they're not going to have need for laws or have rules of laws or regulations about these things. I have almost forgotten to say that since what we call honor is scarcely known in these states, suits concerning honor, such as important subjects among us, monarchical states, do not arise there. Despotism is self-sufficient. Now, this is interesting. Despotism is self-sufficient. Everything around it is empty. Thus, when travelers describe countries to us where despotism reigns, they rarely speak of the civil laws. Therefore, all occasions for disputes and proceedings are taken away there. That is, in part, what makes pleaders so mistreated. The injustice of their request appears badly, being neither hidden, mitigated, nor protected by the infinity of laws. So, therefore, this is the In fact, he makes the right there. He talks about okay, simplicity of rules, monarchy. I mean, not monarchy. Sorry, despotism. Very simple rules, very uniform rules. So it actually is despotic government. Monarchical government, because of distinctions of persons and the complexity of the situation, and the distinctions of persons and the different needs of the princes and the different territories and lands and the very differentiations of things, only the complexity, massive complexity, and not simple, right? Chapter 2, on the simplicity of criminal laws in various governments. It is constantly said that the justice should be rendered everywhere as it is in Turkey. Can it be? Can it be that the most ignorant of all peoples have seen clearly the one thing in the world that is the most important for men to know? People say simple rules of way Turkish. This kind of simple regulations that Turkey is the kind of guideline. The argument, however, this is the most. He's questioning this, right? If you examine the formulas of justice in relation to the, the difficulties a citizen endures to have his goods returned to him or to obtain satisfaction from some insult, you will doubtless find the formalities too many. If you consider them in relation to their liberty and security of citizens, you will find them too few, and you will see that the penalties, expenses, delays, and even dangers of justice are the price each citizen pays for his liberty. So, in other words, these things, penalties, expenses, delays, and things, this is the price each citizen pays for his liberty. In Turkey, where one pays very little attention to the fortune, life, or honor of the subjects, all disputes are speedily concluded in one way or another. The manner of ending them is not important, provided that there are endings. The pasha is no sooner informed that he has the pleaders bashindud. Okay, that's the word. I think it's a typo here, but banished or something. Banished according to his fancy, or punished, or bandishtud according to his fancy, and sends them back home. And for one of them to and for one to have the passion of pleaders would be quite dangerous there. These passions presuppose an adamant desire to see justice done, a hatred, an active spirit, a steadfastness in pursuit of justice. All this should be avoided in the government where there must be no feeling other than fear, and where everything leads abruptly and unforeseeably to revolutions. Each man should know that the magistrates must not hear him, and that he owes his safety only to his nothingness. But in moderate states, where the head of even the lowest citizen is esteemed, his honor and goods are removed from him only after long examination. He is deprived of his life only when the homeland itself attacks him. And when the homeland attacks his life, it gives him every possible means of defending it. Thus, a man who makes himself more absolute, his first thought is to simplify the laws. In these states, he begins by being struck more by particular drawbacks than by the liberty of the subjects, which he is not concerned. So, therefore, this idea, despotic power leads to simplicity. The abuse, well, you want to be absolute, you want simplicity, you want quickness of the rules. You don't want to think about it as simple answers. I've always argued, this is my problem. Corvin Mikke, the Polish political thinker and political writer, who talks about, no, we shouldn't have any governments, no laws, no rules. It was better during the time of the Austrian monarchy. No, Austrian monarchy was in many ways a despotism, despotic government in this sense. Why? Because yet, they didn't have simple rules. They actually had very complex rules with the aristocrats. But and therefore, I think that's why I think there's elements. But places where simplistic rules operate are not respecting people, right? Now let's continue these last two paragraphs. One can see there must be at least as many formulas in a republic as in monarchies. So republic also, in both governments, formalities increase in proportion to the importance given to the honor, fortune, life, and liberty of the citizens. So therefore, As more important, the more the important of the honor, fortune, life, liberty, and liberty of citizens are, the more they're going to be formalities. The formalities will be relative to the importance of the portion of import. There was the relative size of formalities will be connected to the relative importance given in those in republics or monarchies to honor, fortune, life, and liberty of citizens. All men are equal in republican governments. They are equal in despotic governments. And the former is because they are everything, and the latter is because they're nothing. Yeah, that's interesting. Therefore, in other words, that is in Republican governments, you're going to have care for formalities regarding honor, life, fortune, and because they're everything. The formality, because the citizens are everything, you have to have the level of formality and rules and regulations. Chapter 3: in which government, in which governments, and in which cases should judge according to a precise text of law. The more the government approaches a republic, the more the manner of judging becomes fixed. It was the vice of the Lacedaemonian Republic that the ephors judged arbitrarily without laws to guide them. In Rome, the first consuls judged like ephors. Drawbacks of this were felt, and precise laws were made. In despotic state, there is no law. The judge himself is the rule. In monarchical state, there is law, and when it presides, the judge follows it. When it is not, he seeks its spirit. In Republicans' laws, it is a Republican government. It is the nature of the Constitution for judges to follow the letter of the law. No law can be interpreted to the detriment of the citizen when it is a question of his goods, his honor, or his life. Right. Therefore, in other words, the Republican government must follow the letter of the law. Whereas the spirit is the monarchical government concerns itself with the spirit, and Republican government it must be the letter. In other words, what the actual law says. Okay? Where you can have more discretion in monarchical government spirit. Um, in Rome, judges pronounced only that the accused was guilty of a certain crime, and that the penalty was found in the law, as can be seen from the various laws that were made. In England, likewise, a jury decides whether the accused is guilty or not of the deed brought before it. And if he's declared guilty, the judge will pronounce the penalty imposed by law for this deed. And he needs only his eye for that. In other words, in England, the judge would read what the statute says the penalty is. Now that kind of changes. Sometimes the rule is the penalty can be this juries can be decided. It's shifted in American law to the juries decide whether the punishment is this or that. Chapter 4 on the manners of forming judgment. The different ways of forming judgments follows from this. In monarchies, judges assume that the manners of arbiters. They deliberate together. They share their thoughts. They come to an agreement. One modifies his opinion to make it like another's. Opinions with the least support are incorporated into the two most widely held. It is not in the nature. In other words, this is not in the nature of public. In Rome and in Greece, Greek towns, the judges did not communicate with each other. Each gave his opinion in one or three ways. I absolve, I condemn. It is not evident to me. Because the people judged or were thought to judge, but because the people judged or thought to judge. But the people are not jurists. The modifications and tempering of arbiters were not for them. They must be presented with a single object, a deed, or only one deed. And they have only to see whether they should condemn, absolve, or remand judgment. The Romans, following the examples of the Greeks, introduced formula of action at law. The Romans, following the examples of the Greeks, and established that it was necessary for each suit to be managed by the action proper to it. In other words, each suit had to be managed, and this was necessary to their manner of judging. In the state the state of the question had to be fixed in order to keep it before the people. In other words, in order to make sure that people could understand it, they had to have a very clear definition of what was at stake here. Otherwise, in the course of important suit, the state of the question would constantly change and become unrecognizable. So you didn't fix. In other words, you didn't actually define what this question is, and keep it fixed. The danger of it would always be changing in the suit. Again, that's bad, and it would be unrecognizable. Thus, it followed that judges among the Romans would admit only the specific request without increasing, diminishing, or modifying anything. But the praetors imagined other formula for the guidance of action, which were called in good faith. This idea of good faith, and where the manner of pronouncing judgments was at more the disposition of the judge. So therefore, the legal judge was the praetors. The praetors had this. This arrangement was more in agreement with the spirit of monarchy. Thus, French legal experts say in France, all actions are in good faith. And this is an interesting thing. Good faith. Hold on, what is this? 6. That's what the term was in ex bona fides, in good faith. Right? That's a bit of where it comes from. Again, from Justinian, such legal actions were instituted by people they wished, or they wished they both solemn and certain. Right. This is the digest, right? From Roman law. And here is 6. This is a note that even one of them to whom it is demanded he owes is condemned to pay the expense unless he has offered and consigned what he owes. Okay. So now 5. In which chapter 5, in which governments the sovereign can be the judge. Machiavelli attributes the loss of liberty in Florence to the fact that the people, as a body, did not judge the crimes of high treason committed against them, as was done in Rome. 8 judges were established for this, but states Machiavelli, Machiavelli says, are few, but few are corrupted by few. I will gladly adopt this great man's maxim, but as in these cases of treason, political interest forces civil interest, so to speak, for it is always a drawback if the people themselves judge their offenses. The people must provide as much as they can for the security of individuals in order to remedy this drawback. So therefore, you need to give as much they can for the security of individuals to remedy the drawback, the political interest. In other words, the problem here is that political interest forces civil interests. In other words, that political interest of politics and political concerns will force civil these questions of rights and questions of the abuses of privileges and what we call civil law and understanding of disputes, harms done, things like this. Using the idea, the Roman legislators did 2 things. They permitted the accused men to exile themselves before judgment, and they wanted the goods of the condemned men to be made sacred so that people could not confiscate them. In other words, they could exile themselves and move out of Rome in order to protect themselves before a judgment was made. Or they could make this. They would make the goods that were going to be confiscated sacred. In other words, it's holy and not able to, people cannot confiscate them. Okay. The other limits were placed on the people. The other limitations placed on the people's power to judge will be seen in Book 11. As Book 11 is the question of judgments. What was Book 11? Book 11 is going to be the famous book, um, uh, which is on the laws that form political liberty, right, in the relation to their constitution. So, how does political liberty arise through each constitution, type of constitution? And therefore, this is the limits on that, right? Solon knew very well how to curb the people's abuses of their power when judging crimes. He wanted the Areopagus, the highest court to review the suits. And if he believed the accused to be unjustly acquitted, he accused him again before the people. And if it believed him unjustly condemned, it checked the execution and had the suit judged again. An admirable law, which subjected the people to the censure of the magistrate they most respected, and to their own censor as well. It will be well to slow down such suits, especially after the accused is made a prisoner, so that the people will be calmed and will judge with cool heads. In despotic states, the prince himself can judge. He cannot judge. He cannot judge in monarchies. In constitution, the constitution would be destroyed, and immediately dependent powers reduced to nothing. One would see all the formalities of judgment cease. Fear would invade all spirits. One would see pallor, fear, and this white sense on every face. There would be no more trust, honor, love, security, or monarchy. So the king cannot judge. Despotic states, princes can judge themselves. Monarchies, they cannot. If they do, all this disaster. Here are some other reflections. In monarchical states, the prince is the party who pursues those who are accused and has them punished or acquitted. If he himself judged, he would be both jury and party, right? So he can't be both. In other words, he's the accuser, right? He's a party in the case. In these same states, the prince often receives what is confiscated. If he judged the crimes, he would also be both jury and party. Moreover, he would lose the finest attribute of the sovereignty, which is that of pardoning. In other words, this idea, if he's in other words, if he's now judge, it's going to be hard to be pardoning. He overturns the judge, right? It would be senseless for him both to make and unmake his own judgments. He would not want to contradict himself. So therefore, this is why in monarchies, monarchs don't judge. Judges are created. They don't. He does that. He separates them from him, so he can overturn them. In other words, he can pardon. He's a party also because he's the one who's accusing. He's the one who is will be rewarded if the penalty, right? Beyond the confusion into which this would throw all ideas, one would not know if the man had been acquitted or pardoned, right? Louis XIII wanted to be the judge in the cases against the Duke de la Vente. For this purpose, called into his chamber some officer of the parliament and the state councils. As the king forced them to give an opinion on the warrant for arrest, the president of Belvedere said he saw nothing strange in this business where a prince would give an opinion in the case of one of his subjects. The king had kept only pardons for himself, and that they left commendations to their officers. And your majesty would be glad to see before him, your majesty would be glad to see before him at the bar a man whom by your judgment would go to his death in this hour. That this countenance of a prince who pardons cannot endure this, that this vestige alone suspends the interdict of churches, and that one should never be anything but satisfied on leaving the presence of the prince. In other words, this response by the president of Belvedere saying, this response. When the merits of the case were judged, the same president said in his opinion, it is an unexampled judgment, not to say contrary to all the examples of from the past to the present, that a king of France as judge has, by his opinion, condemned the gentleman to death. In other words, it violated all the principles because the prince, judgments rendered by the prince would be an inexhaustible source of abuses injustice and abuses. The courtiers would exhort his judgment by their badgering. Some of the Roman emperors had a craze for judging. No reign stunned the universe more by their injustices than these. Tacitus says, as Claudius has taken for himself the judgment of suits and the functions of magistrates, he occasioned all sort of rapine. When Nero, upon becoming emperor after Claudius, wanted to win over the men's spirits, he declared that he would not take care. He would that he would take care not to be the judge of all suits, so that the accusers and the accused within the wall of the palace should not be exposed to the iniquitous power of a few freed men. Ironically, that we think Claudius is the good one and Nero is the bad one, but Nero says, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do this," right? And the reign of Arcadius, says Zosimus, the nation of slanderers increased, surrounded the court as it infected it. It was assumed when a man died that he had left no children. His goods were given. By a rescript of the emperor. As for the prince, as the prince was strangely dull-witted and the empress venturesome to excess, she served the insatiable avarices of her domestics and confidences, so that for moderate people nothing was more desirable than death. Okay? In other words, this idea this would happen. It was the queen, the empress was so desirous for this, but she kept on appeasing her friend, her domestics, and the confidences. That therefore death was preferable. Formally, says Procopus, there were few people in court, but under Justinian, since the judges were no longer free to render justice, the tribunals were deserted, while the prince's palace responded with the clamor of parties soliciting suits. Everyone knows how judgments and even laws were sold there. So Justinian was with the great laws, but then whatever. The laws are the prince's eyes. He sees with them what he could not see without them. Does he want to perform the function of the tribunal? Then he works not for himself, but for those whom would deceive him. So that's the problem. He ends up here. He ends up arguing that the problem here is that the laws are his eyes, the prince's eyes, and therefore should not be tribunal in that sense. The tribunal should be not his. If he wants to perform the thing, then he's not works for himself, but works for those who wish to deceive him in that sense. And that's how he ends that chapter. In a monarchy, the ministers should not judge. Chapter 6, right? It is also a great drawback in a monarchy for the ministers of the prince themselves to judge contested suits. The ministers means executive officers, right? Today we still see states in which there are innumerable judges to decide suits concerning the fix, and the ministers who would believe it still want to judge them. In other words, the question of money, finances. Fiscs are the question of money, damages, and things like this. Reflections on this subject crowd upon me. I shall offer just one. So therefore, there's lots of reflections, but I'm going to offer one. There is, by the nature of things, a kind of contradiction between the monarch's council and his tribunals. The king's council should be composed of few persons. The tribunals of the judiciary require many. The reason is that the king's council one must undertake public business with a certain passion and pursue it likewise. This can be expected only from 4 or 5 men who make it their business. Tribunals of the judiciary must, on the contrary, be cool-headed and in a way neutral in all matters of business. So therefore, in other words, a minister has to be, there's to be few of them, and they have to be very concerned and attentive to the thing they're doing. They have to really care about it, and they have to be committed. Whereas a judicial tribunal needs to be what? It needs to be, it should be larger, but also it should be cool-headed and neutral in these issues. Chapter 7 on the single magistrate. Such a magistrate can have a place only in despotic government. In Roman history, one sees to what point a single judge can abuse his power. How could Appius, in his tribunal, not have despised the law, since he violated even the law that he had made? Livy tells us that this decemvir's inquisitus distinction had introduced he had induced a man to claim before him that was his slave. Virginia was his slave. Virginia's relatives asked that by virtue of this law she be returned to them until final judgment. He declared that this law had been made only to benefit the father, and that as Virginius was absent and was thus not applicable. This is that famous case, right? This is Livy's simple sort, the trial of Virginia, right? This is that famous lawsuit, right? Since the father's girl's absence, he thought it an opportune moment to commit the injustice, in which he then kills in order to prevent his daughter from being turned over to this person. Father of Virgilius kills her, right? This is a famous story. This is the on the accusations of various chapter 8 on the accusations of various government. In Rome, citizens were permitted to accuse one another. This established in the spirit of the republic, where citizens should have boundless zeal for public good, where it is assumed that each citizen has all the rights of the homeland in his hand. The maxims of the republic were founded under the emperors, and one saw a dreadful kind of man, a band of informers, um, immediately appear. In other words, that once the maxims of the republic followed under the emperors, then what happened? Everyone, in other words, in a republic, everyone should be accusers, but in a monarchy or like this, or even a despot, in a monarchy, or when there's an emperor, right? Well, this becomes horrifying. The maxim followed under the emperors, and one saw a dreadful kind of man and band of informers. Okay. Whoever had uh, whoever had many vices and many talents, a common soul, and an ambitious spirit, would seek out a criminal whose condemnation might please the prince. This way, this was the way to advance to honors and to fortune, a thing that we never see amongst ourselves, the French. At present, we have an admirable law. It wants the prince, who is established in order to see to the execution of the laws, to appoint an officer in each tribunal who will pursue all crimes in his name. Thus the office of informer is unknown to us. And if this public avenger were suspected of abusing his ministry, he would be obliged to name the one who had made he would be obliged to name the one who had made the denunciation. In Plato's laws, those who neglected to alert or aid magistrates are to be punished. This would not be suitable today. A party, the party for the party for the public keeps watch for its citizen. It acts, and they are tranquil. So the party, in other words, if the people were that, then the people should be active, and therefore those who neglect to alert this should be punished, right? But then, if there's a party that keeps the eye of this, then the people should they the party for the public keeps watch for the citizens. It acts, and they're tranquil. The argument goes here. D. Um, the party public. Okay, this is his line there. Chapter 9 on the civilities of penalties in various governments. Severity of penalties suits despotic governments, whose principle is terror, better than monarchies and republics, which have honor and virtue in their springs. In other words, this idea that, remember, he devises up these principles, and this is interesting that today we don't. Does the modern state really? I mean, look at Hobbes. What is the basis of the modern state but fear? Right? Fear is the whole basis of the logic of the modern state. Um, this is why the question here about this. This is interesting. Montesquieu is rebelling against Hobbes in a great degree here. Uh, uh, in moderate states, love of the homeland, shame, and fear of blame are motives that serve as restraints, and so can check many crimes. The greatest penalty for bad actions will be to be convicted of it. Right? The greatest penalty for a bad action will be convicted of that. Right? Therefore, in moderate states, civil laws will make corrections more easily and will not need as much force. So moderate governments don't will need make corrections and they'll correct and don't need force. Despotic laws need lots of force and terror. So therefore, this idea that in moderate governments, states civil laws will make corrections more easily and need not much force. In these states, a good legislature will insist less on punishing crimes than on preventing them. He will apply himself more to giving more than to inflicting punishment. Chinese writers have perpetually observed that in their empire, the more severe the punishments, the nearer the revolution. And this is the case because punishments increased in severity to the extent that mores were lost. Right? This is the Chinese idea. It would be easy to prove that in all or nearly all the states of Europe, penalties have decreased or increased in proportion as one has approached or departed from liberty. So, in other words, as one has gone close to liberty, the penalties have decreased, and as one departs from liberty, they increase. In despotic countries, one is so happy that one fears death more than one. In other words, in despotic countries, one is so unhappy that one fears death more than one cherishes life. Therefore, punishment should be more severe there. In moderate states, one fears the loss of life. In other words, so that one fears death more than one cherishes life. He says, in moderate states, one fears the loss of life more than one dreads death as such. Punishments that simply suppress life are sufficient there. Extremely happy men and extremely unhappy men are equally disposed to harshness. So extremely happy men and unhappy men are equally disposed to harshness. Witness monks and conquerors. Only the middling sort of the good mixture of good fortune and bad are for gentleness and pity. So that was the extremes. The very good and the extremely happy and the extremely unjust want harshness. Monks and conquerors, right? Only the middling sort of mixture of good fortune with bad or for gentleness and pity. That's a very interesting point. This is very Aristotelian of him in that sense. One can find in the various nations that one sees in men taken individually. There is equally cruelty among savage peoples, whose who lead a hard life, and among the peoples of despotic governments, where fortune only favors one man exorbitantly and abuses all the rest. Gentleness reigns in moderate government. When we read in histories for examples of the atrocities, the atrocious justice of the sultans, we feel a kind of sorrow. We feel the kind of sorrow, the ills of human nature. In moderate government, a good legislature can form anything into penalties. It is not quite extraordinary that in Sparta, one of the principal penalties forbade a man to lend his wife to another, or to receive that man's wife, or ever to be in his own house except with virgins. Or in a word, whatever the law calls a penalty is in fact a penalty. So this is in that sense. The Old French Law, number 10, chapter 10, on the Old French laws. In the Old French laws, one finds in the spirit of monarchy. One surely finds the spirit of monarchy. In cases involving pecuniary penalties, money's about money, right? About pecuniary penalties. Non-nobles are punished less than nobles. It is quite the contrary for crimes. The noble loses his honor and his voice at court, while the villain who has no honor is punished corporally, punished with his body. So pecuniary penalties, non nobles are punished less than nobles. But in crimes, they're, a noble's honor and loss you punish the villain, the plebe, and that who's the villain with their body. With that, you dishonor, you take away the honor of a noble. That's going to be that crucifies it. Chapter 11. That when a people is virtuous, few penalties are needed. The Romans were a people of integrity. Their integrity was so strong that often the legislature needed only to show them the good to have them follow it. It seemed that it was enough to give them counsel instead of ordinances. Almost all the penalties in the royal laws and in the laws of the 12 tables were removed during the Republic, either in accordance with the Valerian law or in the consequence of the Porcian law. So the Valerian law was 28, was made by Valerius much as soon as the expulsion of the kings. It was renewed twice, both time magistrates and their families, says Livy, says Book 10. It was not a question of it giving more force, but perfecting its provision more like this, right? So therefore, this is like that. And the Porcian law was made to protect the citizens of Livy. It was made. It was made in Rome the year 454, right? One observes that the Republic was no more poorly ruled, and that no injury to its police resulted. The Valerian law, which forbade the magistrate to attack in any way a citizen who had appealed to the people, inflicted on one who transgressed the law only the penalty of the reputation for wickedness. The 30, right? This is nothing. It added nothing other than that. It deemed to be a wicked act. Livy, right? This is correct from Livy. Chapter 12: The power of the penalties. On the power of penalties. Experience has shown that in countries where penalties are gentle, the citizen spirit is struck by them as struck by them as it is elsewhere by heavy ones. In other words, penalties are gentle. Penalties can be just the citizen's spirit is struck by them as if they were heavy ones. And is some defect felt in a state? A violent government wants to correct it instantly. And instead of considering that the old laws should be executed, one establishes cruel penalties that check the ills then and there. But the springs of the government wear down. The imagination becomes injured to this heavier penalty as it had to the lesser. And as fear of the lesser penalty diminishes, one is forced to establish the heavier in every case. Highway robberies were common in some states. One wanted to check them. The punishment of the wheel was invented, which halted them for a while. Since that time, there have been robberies on the highway as before. In our time, desertion. In our time, desertion had been very frequent. The death penalty has been established against deserters, yet desertion has not diminished. There is a very natural reason for this. A soldier, accustomed for risking his life every day, despises danger and flatters himself that he despises it. He is accustomed to fearing shame every day. The penalties of marking him for life should have been kept. In other words, 31. The nose is broken or the ear was cut off. There it is. It was claimed that the penalty had been increased and the reality had been diminished. Men must not be led to extremes. One should manage the means that nature gives to us to guide them. In other words, man must not be led to extremes. Extreme, too, one should manage the means that nature has given us to guide men. Right? If one examines the causes of every instance of laxity, one will see that that it is unpunished crimes and not moderated penalties. So, not penalty to crime leads to this instance of laxity, not moderated penalties. Let us follow nature, which has given men shame for their scourge, and let the greatest part of the penalty be the infamy of suffering it. So therefore, the idea of shame, and but again, what if people are shameless? That's the problem. They have no shame, or that they, that's problematic. And again, that's why if there are countries in which shame are not is not an effective punishment, it is a result of tyranny, which has inflicted the same penalties on scoundrels as it has on good people. The word shame. In other words, if you've given the same penalties to good people as bad scoundrels, um, this may be problematic. Then shame, there's no shame is lost. Shame is not an effective punishment. And if you see other countries in which men are restrained only by cruel punishments, reckon again that this arises largely from the violence of the government, which has employed these punishments for slight transgressions. A legislator who wants to correct an ill often thinks only of that correction. His eyes is on that object and not on its defects. In other words, you're paying attention to the wrong thing. Say. Once an ill has been corrected, only the harshness of the legislator is seen. But a vice produced by the harshness remains in the state. Spirits are corrupted, they have become accustomed to despotism. After Lysander won his victory over the Athenians, their prisons were judged. The Athenians were accused of having hurled the captives from two galleys over the precipice for not, and of having revolted in full assembly to cut off the hands of any prisoners they might. The Athenians were all slaughtered except Enidemus, who had who had opposed the Athenian decree. Before sending Pittocles to his death, Lysander reproached him for depraving the spirit of the Athenians and for giving lessons of cruelty to all Greece. After the Argives had 1,500 citizens put to death, says Plutarch, the Athenians ordered expiatory sacrifices so that the gods would turn the hearts of the Athenians from such cruel thoughts. There are two kinds of corruptions. One, when the people do not observe the law. The other is when they are corrupted by the laws. The latter is incurable is an incurable ill because it lies in the remedy itself. In other words, the law is a remedy, and what the law does, the law corrupts, and therefore the remedy itself corrupts. Chapter 13. The powerlessness of Japanese laws. The extravagance of penalties can corrupt despotism itself. Look at Japan. In Japan, almost all crimes are punishable with death because disobedience to such a great emperor as Japan's is an enormous crime. It is not a question of correcting the guilty man, but avenging the prince. These ideas are drawn from servitude and derive chiefly from the fact that the emperor is the owner of all the goods, and almost all crimes are committed directly against his interest. Lies told to the magistrate are punishable with death, a thing that is contrary to natural defense. There, things that do not appear to be crimes are severely punished. For example, a man who risks silver at gaming is punished by death. It is true that these astonishing characters of these opinionated, capricious, determined, and eccentric people who brave every peril and every misfortune seem at first to absolve their legislature for these atrocious laws. But are people who naturally despise death and who disembowel themselves at the slightest fancy, corrected or checked by continual prospects and punishments? Or do they not become accustomed to them? In other words, this idea that they do it by death. No, they commit death. They disembowel themselves for fancies, right? On the subject of education of the Japanese, Accounts tells us that children must be treated gently because they resist penalties, and slaves should not be treated too roughly because they immediately take a defensive posture. From that the spirit from the spirit that should reign in domestic government. One one not judge what should be carried into political and civil government? In other words, that the content of the education of children, these rules, right? That shouldn't this also been taken to the political and civil government? A wise legislature would have sought to lead men's spirit back to a just tempering of penalties and rewards by maxims of philosophy, morality, and religion matched to this character, by the just application of the rules of honor, by using shame as a punishment, and the enjoyment of constant happiness and and by the enjoyment of constant happiness and sweet tranquility. And if this legislature had feared that men's spirits, accustomed to being checked only by cruel penalties, could no longer be checked by a gentle one, he would have acted silently and imperceptibly, would have moderated the penalties for the crime in the most pardonable uh, particular cases until he could manage to modify it in every case. But despotism does not know these springs. It does not lead in these ways. So therefore, it's a wise legislature would have done these things and moderated the situation. These are the ways of moderating that he offers, right? But that despotism does not offer these springs. It does not lead in these ways. It may abuse itself, but that is all it can do. In Japan, it had made an effort. In Japan, it had made an effort and has become more cruel than itself. Souls are everywhere startled and made more atrocious, can be guided only by greater atrocity. This is the origin and the spirit of Japanese laws. But these laws have had fury. Now this is interesting. But these laws had more fury than force. They had succeeded in destroying Christianity, but but such unheard of effects are proof of their powerlessness. The laws wanted to establish a good police. Their weakness has appeared even more clearly. One must read on the account of the meeting between the emperor and the Deco of Macro. This is sorry, 37. This is that from that thing, and that's E. Sorry. Pardon me, I'm doing the text. No, okay, back here. Dun, 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 dun. Ah, okay. The number of people smothered or killed by rogues then was unbelievable. Girls, boys were carried off. They were discovered in the following days, exposed in public places at all hours, entirely naked, shoot up into canvas bags so that they would not know where they had been. Men stole what they wanted. So let me continue because there's a little glitch in this. We'll just stay with the screen here. You see what the thing here. You see my fork here, right? That they were, in other words, men stole what they wanted. In other words, that they were, the punishment was these horrible things. Rogues, a number of people smothered or killed by rogues, and unbelievable girls and men carried off. They were discovered in the following days, exposed to public places in all hours. And naked, screwed up in canvas bags so they did not know where they had been. Men stole what they wanted. Horses' stomachs were split open to make their riders fall. Coaches were overturned in order to plunder the ladies inside. The Dutch, who were told that they could not spend the nights outdoors on the benches without being murdered, departed, and so forth. I shall briefly mention another point. The emperor, given his infamous pleasures, had not married. He ran the risk of dying without an heir. The Deiro sent him two beautiful girls. He married one of them out of respect, but had no commerce with her. His nurse sent for the most beautiful woman in the empire. Nothing availed. The daughter of an armorer caught his fancy. His decision was made. He had a son by her. The ladies of the court, outraged that he had preferred a person of such low birth to them, smothered the child. Um, this crime was hidden from the emperor. He would have caused much bloodshed. Therefore, atrocity in the laws prevents the execution. When the penalty is excessive, one is often obliged to prefer impunity. Right? This is this example of this, so that people they keep quiet because they have to. The punishment would be the massive bloodshed. Right. On chapter 14, on the spirit of the Roman Senate. During the consulate of Valicia, Gablo, and Piso, the Assyrian law was made in order to check the intrigues of Dio. Says that the Senate engaged the consuls to propose it because the tribute C. Cornelius had resolved to establish a terrible penalty for this crime, which the people were strongly inclined to commit. The Senate thought that immoderate penalties would certainly terrify people's spirit, but that as a result, no one would be found to accuse or condemn. Whereas with moderate penalties, they would be both judges and accusers. In other words, that the danger here is if the penalty was so extreme, they might not be willing to be accusing. On chapter 15, on the laws of the Romans respect to the penalties. I am strengthened in my maxims where I find the Romans on my side, and I believe that the penalties depend on the nature of the government. When I see that it, in steps with changes in their political laws, this great people made corresponding changes in the penalties of the civil laws. The royal, okay, in other words, the example of the Romans, they made, in other words, I see that Romans on my side. I believe the penalties that made in the nature of the government. I see that the steps they made in their political laws, this made people great corresponding changes in their civil laws. The royal laws made for a people composed of fugitive slaves and brigands were very severe. The spirit of the public would have required the Decemvirs not to put these laws in the 12 tablets. But those who aspired to tyranny cared nothing about following the spirit of the republic. Concerning the punishment of Metilius Fiticus, the dictator of Alba, whom Tullus Hostilius condemned to be pulled apart by two chariots, Livy says, that this was the first and final punishment that bore witness to one failure to remember humanity. It is he is mistaken. The laws of the 12 tables is full of cruel provisions. The provision that best reveals the designs of the Decemvirs is the pronouncement of the death penalty against authors of libel and against poets. This that is scarcely in accordance with the genius of the republic, where people like to see important men humble. But those who want to overthrow liberty feared writing that could call back the spirit of liberty. So therefore, the 12 tables, the Decemvirs of 12 tables, actually corrupted the laws. After the expulsion of the Decemvirs, almost all of the laws with fixed penalties were removed. They were not expressly abrogated, but the portion law prohibited putting Roman citizens to death. Roman portion law prohibited putting Roman citizens to death. They were no longer acceptable. To that time, one can ascribe what Livy says to the Romans, that they never had a people more love moderation and penalties. But one adds to the great gentleness of penalties, the right of the accused to depart before judgment, one will see that the Romans followed the spirit which I have said is natural to a republic. Sulla, who confused tyranny, anarchy, and liberty, made the Cornelian laws. His regulations seem to have been made only to establish crimes. His define thus defining an infinite number of actions as murder. He found murderers everywhere, by a practice that was followed only too often. He laid snares, scattered thorns, and opened abysses in in the paths of all citizens. Most of all, most of most almost all of Sulla's laws stipulated only the interdiction of water and fire. Caesar added the confiscation of goods because the rich, who kept their patrimonies even in exile, were bolder in committing crimes. After the emperors had established a military government, they soon felt that it was no less terrible for them than for their subjects. They sought to temper it. They believed they needed dignities and respect to accompany them. They drew whatever near to monarchy and divided penalties into three classes. This is the famous classes of 46, right? That this is the Roman three classes, and those regarding the principal persons of state, which were gentle enough; those involving the persons of inferior rank, so persons, the principal person states, inferior rank, and those were which were more severe, and finally those concerning only those of low conditions, and these were the most strict. The ferociousness and senseless Maximus excited, so to speak, the military government, which should have been gentle. The Senate learned, says Capitolinus, that some men had been hung on crosses, others thrown to beasts and wrapped in the skins of freshly killed beasts without regard to dignities. He seemed to want to exert military discipline on the model on which he intended to regulate civil business. One can find in the consideration of the grandeurs of the Romans and their decadence how Constantine changed the military despotism into a military and civil despotism, and drew nearer to monarchy. In that in that book, one can follow the various revolutions of the state and see how it went from strictness to indolence, and from indolence to impunity. And again, this is the consideration of the Romans. This is Montesquieu's own book. Um, Chapter 16, on the just provisions between the penalties and the crimes. It is essential for penalties to be harmonious among themselves, because it is essential that the greater crime be avoided rather than the lesser one, the one that attacks society rather than the one that runs counter to it. So therefore, this idea of the just proportion between penalties and the crime. Right? An impostor who called himself Constantine Ducas inspired a great uprising in Constantinople. He was caught and condemned to be flogged, but when but as he had accused eminent persons, he was condemned to be burned as a slanderer. It it is it is singular that one should have apportioned penalties in this way between the crime of high treason and of calumny. High treason was punished less than slander. Slander was burned. Right. This recalls a remark of Charles II, King of England. He passed a man in the pillory. He was asked why he was there. Sire, he was told he had written libels against your ministers. Great fool, said the king. Why didn't he write them against me? Nothing would have happened to him. In other words, attacking your ministers, he's punished, but attack the king, it would have been severely. 70 persons conspired against the Emperor Basil. He had them thrashed. Their hair and beards were burned. When a stag caught the emperor's belt with his antler, one of his attendants drew the sword and cut the belt and freed him. The emperor had him beheaded, because the emperor said he had drawn his sword against him. Who could believe that these two judgments were rendered under the same prince? In other words, these two inconceivable things, right? Among ourselves, it is a great ill that the same penalties inflicted on highway robbers and, in other words, hold on, this is the same penalties inflicted on the highway robber as on the one who robs and murders. For the public safety, it is evident that there must be some difference in these penalties. In China, robbers who are cruel are cut to bits. Others are not. Because of this difference, one robs there but does not murder. In Muscovy, where the penalty for robbery is the same as for murder, one always murders. Dead men, they say, tell no tales. Where there is no difference in the penalty, there must be some difference in the expectation of pardons. In England, robbers do not murder because, unlike murderers, they can expect to be transported to the colonies. Letters of pardon are a great, in other words, letters of pardon are a great spring of modern government. The powers of the prince to pardon, wisely executed, can have admirable results. The principles of despotic government, a government which does not pardon and which never pardons, deprives it of these advantages. So therefore, in other words, moderate government has pardoning, and therefore they have advantages. It leads to widely prince. In other words, the prince to pardon, widely can have admirable results. And government that therefore is without that too. Chapter 17 of torture or the question for criminals. Because men are wicked, the laws is obliged to assume that them to be better than they are. In other words, because men are wicked, the law is obliged to assume them to be better than they are. Thus, the despotism of two witnesses, thus the disposition of two witnesses is enough in the punishment of all crimes. The law believes them as if they spoke with the mouth of truth. Also, every child conceived during marriage is judged legitimate. The law trusts the mother as if she were modesty itself. Though the law is forced to make preceding assumptions, it is not forced. It is not forced to use the question in criminal cases. It's torture, right? The question is torture. Today, we see a well-policed nation reject it without meeting drawbacks. 55, the English nations, right? And 56 is that the use of the questions is therefore not necessary by its nature. 56, he says, the citizens could not be put to the question, in other words, except in the cases of high treason. The question was used 30 days after condemnation. There was no preparatory question as for the Roman laws. In other words, as Justinian so show, that birth, dignity, and professions in the militia guaranteed protections from the questions, as if it were not the case of the crimes of treason. See the wise restrictions made by the Lex Urtigamus on this practice. Okay, so therefore the question of the practice, right? So many clever people and so many men of genius have written against this practice that I dare not speak after them. I was going to say that it might be suitable for despotic government, where everything inspiring fear enters more into the spring of government. I was going to say that slaves among the Greeks and Romans, but I hear the voice of nature crying out against me. So nature, he's going to say something about despotic, then he's silent. Nature forces him to be silent. In chapter 18, on the pecuniary penalties and corporal penalties. Our fathers, the Germans, admitted almost none of the pecuniary penalties. These men, who were both warriors and free, considered their blood should be spilled only when they were armed. In Japan, by contrast, reject these sorts of penalties as the pretext that rich people would escape punishment. So pecuniary, like money, fines like this. But do not make rich people fear the loss of their goods. Cannot pecuniary penalties be proportionate to fortunes? And finally, cannot infamy be joined with these penalties? A good legislator takes a middle way. He does not always order a pecuniary penalties, but he does not always inflict corporal penalties. The laws in chapter 19, the laws of retaliation. In despotic states, which prefer simple laws, much as makes much use of the laws of retaliation. Moderate states sometimes accept it, but the difference is that the former have it exercises strictly, while the other almost. The difference is that the former has it exercised strictly. In other words, and while the others almost always temper. In other words, the laws of the 12 tables admitted both its sentence in terms of retaliation only when the pleader could not be appeased. After sentencing, one could pay damages and interest, and a corporate penalty would be converted into a pecuniary penalty. In other words, the Roman table said that if you couldn't appease the thing, that okay, you could then a corporal penalty could be converted into a monetary penalty. Chapter 20, on fathers being punished for their children. Fathers are punished in China for the offense of the children. This was the usage of Peru. It is another punishment derived from despotic states. Apparently, this is despotic states. Right? It is all very well to say that China, the father is punished for not having used paternal power established by nature and augmented by laws themselves. This always assumes that there is no honor among the Chinese. Among ourselves, fathers whose children are condemned, to punishment, and children whose fathers have met the same fate are punished as much by shame as they would be by China by loss of life. Chapter 21, on clemency of the prince. Clemency is a distinctive quality of monarchs. In republics, which has virtue as its principles, it is less necessary. In despotic states, where fear reigns, it is used less because the important men of the state must be restrained by examples of severity. In monarchies, where one is governed by honor, which often requires that the law prohibits, it is more necessary. Disgrace there is the equivalent to a penalty, and even the formalities of judgments are punishments. There, shame comes from all sides and forms penalties particular to monarchies. The important men there are so heavily punished by disgrace that often by the often imaginary loss of their fortune, their credit, their habits, their pleasures, that strictness in respect to them is useless. It can only serve to take from the subjects the love they bear the person that they bear the person of the prince, and respect they should have for the possession. In other words, if you go too high, you have to be careful. You have to go too much, and they'll even lose respect, love of the prince, right, and the respect for possessions. Just as the instability of important men is the nature of despotic government, their security enters into monarchy. Nature of monarchy. In other words, the instability of important men is important for despotism. Therefore, despotic rules always have to have the powerful people constantly unsafe and insecure. And here, in monarchy, they need to be secure. Monarchies have so much to gain from clemency that it followed by such love that and draws such glory from it that it almost always a fortunate thing for them to have occasion to exercise it, and one can always do it in our countries. There perhaps will be disputes over some branch of authority, almost, but sorry, there will be disputes over some branch of their authority, but almost never over the whole authority. And if someone fights for the crown, they never fight for their lives. But one will ask, when is one to punish? When to pardon? This is something better felt than prescribed. Though clemency has dangers, they are visible. So clemency has dangers, and they are visible. So it was one asked, when is one to punish? When is to pardon? This is something to be felt rather than prescribed. Though clemency has dangers, they are visible. You can see them, right? Clemency is easily distinguished from the weakness that leads the prince to scorn punishing, and even lacked the power to do so. The Emperor Maurice resolved never to shed blood of his subjects, and Astatius did not punish crimes. Isaac the angel swore that during his reign he would put no one to death. The Greek emperors had forgotten they did not carry the sword in vain. This is the danger of this, right? This is the dangers of making these things. But they made justice by not punishing and not doing this. They brought injustice. They brought the disorder. So therefore, this here we end. I'm apologizing. This I don't know whether there's going to be a camera here now, a picture of me or not. I don't think. And because of the picture disappearing, when it did because of a text issue. Um, I hope this is not going to be just totally messed up because maybe the text won't be readable because the picture may be there. And oh my God, I don't know. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below about this chapter, this book of the book of Montesquieu. If you have any issues or things or points about this question about what the topic of this, please put it there. If you liked it, like it, share it with a friend. If you didn't like it, you can say that, but say why you didn't like it. You can follow my social media posts below, and if you can follow me on the links that are linked below. If you also want to help me continue them with these things and maybe get better problems on that, have less problems, you can help me by becoming a Patreon or subscribe star below, or you can buy one of my books available on Amazon or other means. Okie dokie, I will leave you go. Take care, and we'll see you our next session. Bye bye.